Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another edition of Wow, Lynch, Wow, dedicated to filmmaker David Lynch and inspired by the triumphant return of Twin Peaks. There will be spoilers in this video on all things Twin Peaks, so viewers be warned.
Is it future or is it past?
It all started with Pete Martell headed out for some morning fishing. Unfortunately, Pete never got to go fishing on this particular morning, because it was then that he discovered a body wrapped in plastic. Who killed Laura Palmer? FBI Special Agent Dale Cooper would soon arrive on the scene to investigate her murder, and early in this investigation we learn that Cooper is dealing with a serial killer. But then in a bizarre dream sequence, the fates of Cooper and Laura became forever intertwined in an unexpected way. Cooper dreamt of Laura in the lodge, he learned of Bob and Mike, and Laura whispered the name of her killer to Cooper. It was later revealed that Laura had the very same dream, which she depicted in her diary. In Season 1 and the early parts of Season 2, the main focus was Cooper's investigation into the secret life of Laura Palmer, and Cooper ultimately solved the case and caught Laura's killer. At this point, the story began reforming shape, where the focal points now became centered around Bob, the White Lodge, and the Black Lodge. In Fire Walk With Me, we learned that the dynamic between Cooper and Laura predated Cooper's arrival in Twin Peaks. Indeed, we learn that it even predates Laura's murder itself. When Albert was testing Cooper for the record, Coop intuitively knew a great deal about the next victim, and he had some type of connection with her. This idea was amplified throughout Fire Walk With Me, where Cooper appeared to be observing Laura from the lodge during her final days right up until her tragic end. Cooper was urging her from afar not to take the ring. I maintain it's very important to note that Cooper didn't want Laura to have the ring, but one-armed Mike most certainly did want her to have it, and he went out of his way to make this happen. Once Mike gave Laura the ring, he didn't have a care in the world for anything else, least of all poor Ronette. Fire Walk With Me ultimately ended with what appeared to be a happy ending. Laura was smiling and laughing alongside Cooper inside the lodge, and Laura looked thrilled to be there, and I'll get back to this later. Fast forward to the return. It opens on the iconic moment of Laura telling Cooper she'd see him again in 25 years. But before we do actually see them together again, that scene is immediately preceded by the moment when Mike said to Cooper, "Is it future or is it past?" Then we see Cooper and Laura having a conversation, parts of which sound awfully familiar. So at the time, when Mike asked if it was future or past, it seemed like something reflective of the fact that Twin Peaks had been away for 25 years, and now it was finally back 25 years later. So Laura seems to get sucked away, and Mike's there again delivering the very same line. Is it future or is it past? Then Mike leads Coop to the evolution of the arm, and he reminds Cooper of his own doppelganger. The arm informs Coop his doppelganger must leave before he can go back. And when this scene continues, the arm begins repeating the name Bob before telling Coop he can go now. Coop tries to leave, but he's blocked. So he starts wandering around the lodge, and he stumbles across Leland. Leland wants him to find Laura. Coop continues on his way, and is ultimately banished to the realm of non-existence by the doppelarm. Coop makes a quick stop in the glass box, and then he is swept away again into the realm of non-existence, before ultimately switching places with Douglas Jones. Dougie Jones was the Tulpa creation who was somehow manufactured by Bad Coop, and we're led to believe that, at the very least, the doppelarm may have been in on Bad Coop's plan to cheat his way out of returning to the lodge. And it appears that Cooper switching with the Dougie Tulpa helped maintain the necessary balance. I think it's worth noting that just before the first time we see Mike ask if it's future or past, Hawk was speaking with the log lady, and both were under the impression that something important was supposed to happen. Hawk was by the lodge entrance where Cooper first disappeared, and he witnessed evidence of something, but nothing materialized because Coop had been tricked. Cooper was essentially useless concerning the main story when he was stuck in Dougie Jones mode. But when he finally snapped back to his old self, he seemed to know exactly what to do, and he remembered everything that happened under the incompetent guise of Dougie. His first mission after waking up dealt with Bob and his doppelganger. When Coop became Coop again, this was the first objective he pursued. But Cooper didn't really do a whole lot here. The Giant had seen to it that Bad Coop would wind up at the sheriff's station and not at the Palmer house. So Coop basically just had to show up. It was Lucy and Freddie who did all of the heavy lifting, and then Cooper took the final step and placed a ring on his doppelganger's finger. Even though Cooper didn't do any of the heavy lifting, he appeared to know exactly what to expect, and everything appeared to play out exactly as he had foreseen it, up to and including the transformation of the eyeless woman into Diane. So after that, Cooper's next objective was locating the long-lost Philip Jeffries. Cooper meets up with Mike, and Mike leads Cooper to Jeffries, who in turn tells Cooper where to find Judy. Mike then seemingly sends Cooper on his way in order to find Judy. I'll remind everyone at this point that Mike went out of his way to get the ring to Laura Palmer. And Cooper didn't want Laura to take that ring. Cooper and Mike were at odds on this point. But when Cooper needs to find Jeffries, he depends on Mike. Mike is the one who leads Cooper up to him, and then Mike is the one who sends Cooper where he needs to go. Cooper arrives where he's going, and it's the night that Laura Palmer gets killed. Cooper is out there like some creepy stalker tracking her every move, and he intercepts her while Jacques, Leo, and Ronette wait for a Laura who never shows. Cooper wants to take Laura home, and Coop convinces Laura to go with him. And this transitions from black and white into color, indicating, I believe, the creation of a new alternate timeline. Cooper changed the past, and we know he changed the past because Laura's body gets erased from the shore, and Pete finally got to go fishing. So Pete's fishing, Cooper succeeded in saving Laura and changing the past. This idea is expanded on in the final dossier, where Tammy mentions in this new timeline that Cooper arrived in Twin Peaks to investigate the disappearance of Laura Palmer. So Laura went missing, and the final dossier also confirms that Cooper himself still ultimately went missing. So we know Cooper still wound up in the lodge, and we can probably assume that he was still there trying to save Annie from Wyndham Earl. When Laura disappeared from Cooper's grasp, it aligned with the sounds the Giant had played for Cooper in the opening scene, and also the scream we heard from Laura when she was seemingly torn from the lodge. Neither of these sounds seemed to mean anything to Cooper when he heard them, and this was the first time since Cooper woke up that we see him confused and lacking control. Then Cooper winds up back in the lodge. And this has always bothered me until I read a comment by Nancy Noyes in my previous video, when suddenly everything seemed to make more sense to me, and it seemed obvious, but I never thought about it in quite the right way, and I had completely neglected the most important lesson from Back to the Future Part 2. In changing the past, Cooper also changed his own past. We know this because it's confirmed in the final dossier, but even without that, we know the past changed because Pete got to go fishing. So that moment when Mike asks, is it future or is it past? I now firmly believe that this point acts as a constant marker in time. But this time around, Cooper is in the lodge 25 years later after he altered the past. This is the Cooper who was investigating Laura's disappearance, not the Cooper who was investigating her murder. After Mike delivers the line this time, Laura never shows up to tell Cooper he can go. She never kisses him, she never whispers to him, she never gets torn away. Instead, what we see is an empty seat, and Cooper looks as if he knows something is off and that Laura or someone should be in that chair. So it continues like the last time, with Mike leading Cooper to the arm. Except this time, the arm doesn't speak of doppelgangers or Bob. Instead, he asks, is it the story of the little girl who lived down the lane? Is it? The statue isn't there this time. Then Cooper seems to either re-experience or remember the events of Laura whispering to him and being sucked away out of the lodge. Cooper then has an identical encounter with Leland, except this time, the angle is reversed. This was from part 2, and this was from part 18. And this time, Cooper feels around as if he's searching for the right exit. He emerges from where we first saw him disappear. It's the very same place where Hawk had been looking for him in the reality where Laura was murdered. But this time, Hawk isn't there. Instead, Diane is the one who's there waiting for him. And they both tell each other that it's really them. When Cooper was finally back to his old self in the reality where Laura was murdered, his first objective dealt with Bob and his doppelganger. These were the things the arm spoke to him about before he was about to leave the lodge the first time. This time, Cooper's primary objective has nothing to do with Bob and nothing to do with his doppelganger. It has to do with the clues he received from the giant. But this might also be related to what the arm said before Cooper left, only this time it was about the story of the little girl who lived down the lane. Cooper doesn't have to deal with Bob or his doppelganger this time around. In the final dossier, we learn that Leland committed suicide on the 1-year anniversary of Laura's disappearance. If that's the case, then it seems safe to assume that Bob wouldn't have been in the lodge when Cooper confronted Wyndham Earl. And yet, Cooper must have still somehow survived his encounter with Earl. Could Cooper have also faced his shadow self with perfect courage in the absence of Bob? Or did Bob transcend time and space in such a way that his destruction in any timeline meant his destruction in all timelines? Or the reverse? Or could Cooper, having gone into the lodge this time, have had nothing to do with Wyndham Earl at all? Whatever the case, Cooper isn't concerned with Bob or his doppelganger this time around, but he still wants to bring Laura home. And first he has to find Laura. This involves crossing over, and Coop finds the right location, apparently from the Giants' 4:30 clue. Why does Cooper want to take Laura home? What is he hoping to accomplish? Taking Laura home was his secondary objective in the timeline when Laura was murdered. Bringing Laura home was also his primary objective in the timeline where Laura went missing. He knows he wants to take Laura home, but it's not clear he knows what he expects will happen. We can assume this has something to do with Judy. Most observers agree that Judy is somehow affiliated with Sarah Palmer. We know that a young Sarah Palmer swallowed a frog moth. And we know, according to the final dossier, that in the new timeline where Laura went missing, that Sarah killed the dude with the Truck U shirt. Frost makes it a point to suggest that this did not necessarily happen in the previous timeline when Laura was murdered. And I think this is extremely important. The moment Cooper changed the past, Sarah freaked out and went wild. Sarah also somehow seemed connected with the jumping man when Mike was leading Coop to Jeffries. When Sarah destroyed the Truck U guy, she revealed her inner darkness, and I maintain that this strongly suggests that Sarah is inhabited by, or associated with, her daughter Laura's doppelganger. The tainted finger we see resembles that of the spiritual finger that Cole mentioned, indicating a doppelganger, and the finger itself is Laura's finger from the moment just before she was murdered in the original timeline. Which again has me thinking about the fact that Mike wanted her to have the ring, but Cooper didn't. And then we see Laura's smile surrounded by darkness. I think this strongly implies that Sarah is in fact directly affiliated with her daughter's doppelganger. And since the final dossier implied that Sarah biting the Truck U dude only happened in the altered new timeline, I think Laura's doppelganger probably is an entity in play here. That would mean that Sarah isn't actually Judy, and also that all of Sarah's scenes from The Return were likely from the altered timeline. But consider this. The Giant created the Laura orb in response to the mother spitting up those evil eggs in the essence of Bob. Initially, I had believed that the Laura orb was created in response to the creation of Bob, but we know that Laura's essence had nothing to do with Bob's apparent destruction at the hands of Hulk-Hand Freddy. So I think it's more likely that the Laura orb was actually created for the purpose of combating Judy. And I absolutely believe that Judy is the mother entity that coughed up Bob and butchered poor Sam and Tracy. So if Laura was created as an entity that will potentially eliminate and cancel out Judy, doesn't that effectively make Judy and Laura's doppelganger the same entity? In both instances, Laura's essence would be facing her polar opposite, her shadow self. So in that sense, wouldn't the worldly manifestation of Judy ultimately take form as Laura's doppelganger? More on that in a bit. So is it future or is it past? How does time exist in the lodge? I think there is maybe a clue to be found in the fact that Bob and Bad Coop were not priorities when Coop exited the lodge in the reality where Laura went missing. And beyond that, Cooper was watching over Laura's final days, even though he entered the lodge long after she had been murdered. He doesn't want her to take the ring, but Mike goes out of his way to give it to her. When Laura put the ring on, two things seemed to happen. One, it immediately prompted Leland to kill her. And it also landed Laura a spot in the lodge. Except when Laura arrives in the lodge, it doesn't really seem like the Black Lodge. Laura looks thrilled to be there, and Cooper is hanging by her side, seemingly in complete control. Cooper almost never seems happy or in control when he's in the lodge. And neither does Laura, but they both look awfully happy and in control here. And this is a stark contrast to every other scene we see with Cooper and Laura inside the lodge. The way Laura and Cooper look, it seems more likely that they are inside the White Lodge, happy and at peace. So Cooper wants to bring Laura home, but he doesn't seem sure what to expect, which is the total opposite of the situation we saw when Coop watched Freddy destroy Bob, where he knew exactly what to expect from Freddy. It seems reasonable that Cooper wanted to force a confrontation between Laura and Judy, or between Laura and her doppelganger, so that Laura could defeat her shadow self and find salvation in the White Lodge with Cooper. Is this why Cooper never wanted Laura to have the ring? If Cooper unwittingly succeeded in his primary mission, then maybe Laura did defeat her shadow self with a deafening scream that shut the electricity down. If that did happen, then maybe Cooper and Laura did wind up together in the White Lodge. But then again, if that was Laura confronting her shadow self, it seems more likely that she did so with imperfect courage, and I believe that would annihilate her soul. But I'm not at all sure what Cooper was hoping to accomplish by bringing Laura home. Whatever his reasons, I am still hopeful that we will get a season 4, because I truly believe that Lynch and Frost have more of the story they would like to tell. I definitely think there is more to the story of Laura and Cooper, and that Cooper didn't actually achieve his primary objective. I think Cooper ultimately failed in his defining moment, and that there's reason to believe his journey might continue. There's more story here. I believe that with every fiber of my being. If I'm wrong, and Lynch comes out officially tomorrow and closes the door on Twin Peaks forever, then I will still be completely satisfied with the entirely wonderful experience of watching The Return. It was a treat, and one which I really still can't believe ever actually came together. But I do think there is more of the story that Lynch would like to tell. And I think one of the biggest clues comes from something Lynch himself said recently at the FYC event. Lynch said, quote, "For a long time, no itch. But at the same time, there's a thing in Fire Walk with Me where Laura is in bed and she's visited by Annie. Annie says, 'I'm in the Black Lodge with the good Dale. Write that in your diary.' That little bit right there held a string of dreams," end quote. Well, if that was the scene that was the key that kept the dream of more Twin Peaks alive, I can't help but think the fact that Lynch made it a point to still have one of those diary pages remain missing I think that helps to continue keeping that dream alive here yet again. And beyond that, Philip Jeffries made it a point to tell Cooper that Gordon Cole would remember the unofficial version. Jeffries said this to Cooper just before Cooper proceeded to change the past on the night Laura Palmer was to be murdered. The fact that Cole will remember the unofficial version, this definitely suggests that there are more obstacles ahead. I, for one, am hopeful that we might get a Season 4 announcement around the same time as the 2018 Emmys, but whatever happens, I absolutely loved Season 3, and I'll always be itching for more Twin Peaks, because that's always been a major part of the incredible appeal. Always itching for more. Thanks for watching, everyone, and have a wonderful night.